Enchanted Island by Ian Serraillier. Murder at Dunsinane, Macbeth. It was a day of mingled storm and sunshine, with dark scudding clouds and torrential bursts of rain. Two Scottish generals, Macbeth and Banquo, were riding home from battle to report a great victory. They had just defeated a rebel army that had risen up against King Duncan of Scotland, whose kingdom in those ancient times was separate from England. Macbeth in particular had shown amazing courage. Brandishing his sword, he had carved his way through the enemy ranks till he stood face to face with their leader. Then with one tremendous blow he had cut his body in two. As the two generals were galloping over a wind-lashed desolate moor, suddenly there was a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. Three weird and ragged figures, like creatures from another world, sprang in front of the horses. They had withered skins, wild glittering eyes, and except for their beards were more like men than women. "Who are you, and what do you want with us?" cried Banquo, reining in his horse. While the rain streamed down their faces, they pressed their choppy forefingers against their skinny lips to show that they would answer no questions. They were witches. "Speak if you can. What are you?" cried Macbeth, as his horse champed and snorted, its hot flanks steaming. "All hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis," cried the first witch. "All hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor," cried the second witch. Macbeth startled. How could he hold that title when the Thane of Cawdor was still alive? "All hail Macbeth," cried the third witch. "Soon you will be King of Scotland." Stirred to his very soul, Macbeth lifted his hands to hide his eyes. Strange thoughts that he did not wholly understand had begun to stir in his brain. Who were these creatures, and what did they intend? Were they bringing him some sort of message from the powers beyond life? If so, was it good or evil? Perhaps fate meant him to be king. Yet, how could the throne ever be his? True, he was the closest kinsman of the king, but Duncan had two sons who would inherit first. While he sat wrapped in thought and too confused to speak, Banquo asked the witches roughly why they did not speak to him, too. "If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, tell me my fortune too," he ordered. "Hail Banquo," cried the first witch, "lesser than Macbeth and greater." "Not so happy, yet much happier," cried the second witch. "Your children will be kings, though you will never be one," cried the third witch, and the three witches cried together, "All hail Macbeth and Banquo." Feverishly eager to know more, Macbeth jumped down from his horse to question them, but there was another clap of thunder, and they melted like breath into the wind and vanished. Almost immediately two horsemen came spurring towards them, the rain beating on their helmets and round shields. They were Ross and Angus, two of the king's noblemen. News of Macbeth's great victory had already reached the court. They thanked him in the king's name, and to his amazement saluted him as Thane of Cawdor. "But the Thane of Cawdor is still alive," Macbeth protested. "Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" "He is under sentence of death for treachery," said Angus. "The king has given the title to you." Already two of the prophecies had been fulfilled. Hopes that the third would also come true were running riot in Macbeth's brain, and for a moment he did not know what to say. Then he turned to Banquo. Do you not hope your children will be kings?" he asked. "If we are all to believe that we have all been told," replied Banquo, half jokingly, "then you have a good reason to hope that the crown of Scotland will one day be yours." But when he saw the tense, wild look on Macbeth's face, he became serious and added a warning. "It is strange, Macbeth, but sometimes the powers of darkness deceive us into trusting them. Afterwards they betray us." From now on, in spite of Banquo's warning, Macbeth could think of nothing but the throne of Scotland and how he might obtain it. Enormously ambitious as he was, he also had a powerful imagination which acted as a brake on his evil desires. Though in battle he was completely fearless, the thought of murdering Duncan filled him with terror and made his heart knock at his ribs. His wife, however, was both strong-willed and utterly ruthless. As ambitious as he was, she lacked that touch of natural kindness which made him hesitate to use foul means to gain his ends, and when he told her of the witches' prophecies, she made light of his fears and spurred him on. She saw clearly that if they were to be king and queen, they must first get rid of Duncan. And when she heard that the king intended to come and stay with them at Dunsinane Castle, she was triumphant. She prayed that the wickedness and cruelty might thicken her blood and fill her whole being, and that no feelings of pity or remorse might ever flow in her veins and shake her terrible purpose. It seemed to her that with the king's arrival, fate was playing into her hands. And at once she began to make plans to provide for him, as she put it. It was a warm evening in the early summer when Duncan, attended by his 2 sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, arrived at the castle. Swallows had been built their nests in the stonework and were flying to and fro among the battlemen, and all was peaceful and tranquillity. Lady Macbeth, who knew very well how to mask her treachery, with smiles and flattery cordially welcomed the royal party at the gate, and taking Duncan's arm, led him into the castle. Delighted with his reception, the king gave her a rich diamond as a token of his regard. But already Macbeth's conscience was disturbing him. The presence of the generous, unexpected king at his own table made him feel deeply uneasy. Excusing himself before the feast was over, he wandered moodily about the castle, wincing whenever he had heard a gust of laughter or merriment from the hall. Highly strung, a prey to his restless imagination, he asked himself anxiously what would be the consequences of murder. Even if he escaped being found out, would he suffer for his crimes in the life to come? Would he not be drinking his own poison? Besides, Duncan was a gentle and gracious king, just and merciful, and his virtues pleaded for him, while Macbeth was his kinsman, his subject, and now his host and protector, completely trusted. What justification had he for murder, except his insatiable ambition? He was in this mood of brooding indecision, pacing up and down the long stone corridors where Lady Macbeth found him. "Why did you leave the hall?" she asked. "Has the king asked for me?" "Of course, we cannot go on with this business," said Macbeth. He began to make excuses. "Then why did you first suggest it?" said Lady Macbeth, bitterly scornful. "You were a man then, not the pale and trembling coward you are now." And she lashed him with her tongue, dismissing all the promptings of his conscience as foolish farce. The joys of royal power, she told him, were theirs for the taking. The deed of murder was easily done and would soon be over, and she gave him reason after reason for not abandoning their plans. "When Duncan is asleep, I will drug his guards drink, so that the way's clear for us," she said. "After the murder, we can leave the daggers in the room, and the blame will fall on the guards, not on us." She had planned every step, and so powerful was her will that Macbeth, for all his scruples, could not stand up against it, and he began to nerve himself to do the hideous deed. Midnight came, the hour when nature seems lifeless and half the world is asleep. Tired by his long journey, Duncan was sleeping soundly with 2 of his personal bodyguards beside him. In the castle of Dunsinane, 2 people alone were awake, Lady Macbeth and her husband, tensely waiting, their senses alert, to catch the tiniest sound as the time for the murder approached. Lady Macbeth remained unperturbed, but Macbeth's imagination began to play tricks with him again. Pacing up and down in the darkness of the great hall, he thought that he could see a dagger floating in the air. The hilt was facing him. There were drops of blood on the blade, and it pointed towards Duncan's room. But when he tried to grasp it, it vanished. It was only a vision conjured up by his brooding, tortured mind. Suddenly a bell rang, echoing hollowly in the sleeping castle. It was the signal that Lady Macbeth was ready. It was Duncan's death knell too. Slowly and silently, his back pressed against the wall, Macbeth started to climb the stone steps that led to Duncan's room. On the top step he seemed to falter. His wife, watching from the shadows below, held her breath and silently willed him to go on. He steadied himself and stealthily opened the door. There was a lantern on a stool, and in the flickering light Macbeth could see Duncan's white head on the pillow, serene and peaceful, his eyes closed in his sleep. The 2 guards were lying on the rugs on the floor beside him, snoring loudly in their drugged slumber. The daggers were on the bed, where Lady Macbeth had left them ready. She had been unable to stab him for herself when she had looked down at the king. His pale, worn face had reminded her of her own father. Seizing the daggers, Macbeth stabbed the sleeping king. He died without a groan, without even a sigh, but one of the drugged guards cried out, "Murder!" in his sleep. The cry rose the others, who shouted, "God bless us," but they were both too dazed to stay awake, and muttering a prayer, they fell asleep instantly. In an agony of horror, Macbeth stumbled out of the room and down the steps to where his wife was waiting. "I have done the deed," he gasped. "Did you not hear a noise?" "I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did you not speak?" "When?" "Now, as I descended, yes." He looked down at his hands. They were red and sticky with blood, and he began to mutter and tremble. He felt he had no triumph at his success, only despair, because his throat had been too parched with fear for him to cry "Amen" to the guard's prayers, and the conviction that he had murdered sleep, and would never rest again, was to torture him. But Lady Macbeth had not lost her self-control. "Go and fetch some water to wash the blood from your hands," she ordered. "Why did you bring the daggers from the place?" She had suddenly noticed that they were still in his hands. "I told you to leave them there and smear the guards with the blood." And she angrily ordered him to take the daggers back. "I dare not go back," cried Macbeth, shaking and whimpering like a child. "Give me the daggers," she said, snatching them from his hand, and she ran up the steps into Duncan's room to do the job herself. While she was away, the silent night was shattered by the noise of knocking. Macbeth was so unnerved that he could not think what it was or where it came from. He looked at his hands and gave a violent start. They seemed to want to rise out of the darkness and pluck out his eyes. He jerked his head away. When Lady Macbeth came out of the room, she saw him gazing in horror at his hands, muttering to himself that not all the water in the 7 seas would wash them clean. "My hands are as red as yours, but I should be ashamed to be such a coward," she scoffed. The knocking was repeated louder than before. Macbeth threw himself against the wall in terror. His wife did not move an inch. "I hear knocking at the south gate," she said, recognizing at once where it came from. "We must go to our room. A little water will remove the blood, and all will be well." More knocking. Macbeth was so paralyzed with terror that he could not move. As the knocking grew louder every moment, he wished with all his heart that it could wake Duncan, but Duncan was beyond all waking now. "We must not be seen here," Lady Macbeth insisted. "Put on your nightgown and pull yourself together." She seized her husband's arm and dragged him to their room. The porter took some time to answer the knocking, having helped himself freely to the drink left over from the banquet. His brain was fuddled, and he was resentful at being roused so early. He fumbled at the keyhole, and at last, with a great rattling of the keys and sliding back of the bolts, the huge gate creaked open, and Macduff and Lennox came in. The first faint glimmerings of morning had already touched the hills, and the 2 nobles had come to wake the king. Within a few minutes, Macduff had discovered the murder. He came running down the steps from Duncan's room, distraught and horrified. The alarm bell began to clang. Soon the whole castle was in an uproar. Macbeth appeared in his dark nightgown, self-assured once more, and making a fine pretense of grief and consternation. But when he said that he wished he had died an hour ago, and that human life had no further value now, his words came from the heart. He was not pretending. Next moment he was describing with dramatic gestures how and why he had slain the 2 guards, but he did not give away the real reason, which was they should have no chance of speaking up for themselves. To Lady Macbeth, the explanation seemed too glib and nervous. She drew the attention away from him by pretending to faint, and her attendants carried her to her room. In the confusion, Malcolm and Donalbain escaped, leaving Scotland together, the one bound for England and the other for Ireland. For a time, suspicion for the murder fell on them. As the throne became vacant, Macbeth, who was next in line of succession, was crowned king, so the 3rd prophecy of the witches was fulfilled. Although he had now achieved his ambition, Macbeth did not feel contented or secure. He could not forget that Banquo, who already had his doubts about the conduct of the new king, thought he kept them to himself, had been promised that he would be father to a line of the kings. Banquo and his son Fleance stood in his way. They must be destroyed. With this in his mind, he announced that he would give a great banquet to which he invited many thanes with Banquo and Fleance as chief guests. On the evening of the banquet, he sent 2 assassins to waylay and murder them, both on their way to the palace. As this final meeting with Banquo, when he had questioned him about his moves during the afternoon so the assassins could be informed, he had told him to be sure not to miss the banquet. "I will be there, my lord," Banquo had replied, and away he rode, never to come back alive. Nevertheless, he was to keep his promise. Though in an unexpected way, the assassins waylaid him about a mile from the palace. There was still a glimmer of daylight in the stormy sky, but it was fading quickly, and Fleance carried a torch. By its smoky gleam they caught a glimpse of Banquo's face, anxiously scanning the sky for rain. They sprang at him, cut his throat, and flung his body into a ditch. But in the scuffle the torch was dropped and the light struck out, and Fleance escaped. Macbeth came to the banquet in a mood of dark despair. For the nights he had been unable to sleep, and his restless, tortured mind was deeply envious of Duncan, sleeping peacefully in his grave, where no signs of man could now ever harm him. Even his wife felt no joy in being the queen. The crime had already begun to appall her. She knew nothing of Macbeth's plans for dealing with Banquo. All he had told her was that before the evening shadows were swallowed up by the night, another dreadful deed would be performed. The guests were waiting to take their seats at the table when Macbeth saw one of the assassins standing by the door. His face smeared with blood, he went over to him and, overjoyed to hear that the blood was Banquo's, who was now lying safe in the ditch with 20 gashes in his head. But when he heard of Fleance's escape, all his fears and doubts came flooding back. "My royal lord, you are neglecting your duty as host," said Lady Macbeth, leaving her chair of state to summon him to the table. The guests had already taken their seats according to rank, and she returned with him to speak to them, a gracious and composed hostess. "I wish Banquo, our guest of honour, were here," said Macbeth. "It's unkind of him to stay away." "He seems to have broken his promise," said Ross. "Will it please your highness to take your seat?" "The table's full," said Macbeth. "Here is your place, sir," said Lennox, getting up and leading him toward an empty chair. "Where?" "Here, my lord." Macbeth stopped. Someone was sitting in the chair, the smoky torches clamped to the wall of the face of Banquo, whose ghost was staring at him with hollow, sightless eyes, his hair soaked with blood. Macbeth's cheeks turned pale and drained of every drop of blood. "Which of you has done this?" he cried. "Done what, my lord?" asked the guests. All they could see was an empty chair. "I never did it. Do not shake your head at me like that," he whimpered, his eyes fixed on Banquo's. "His highness is not well," said Ross, and with a great clattering of chairs the alarmed guests sprang up. "Sit down, my lords. I beg you to sit down," said Lady Macbeth, going from guest to guest in an effort to put them at their ease. "Ever since he was a child, his highness has had fits like these, but they are quickly over. He will soon be all right again if you take no notice." She strode over to him and said, with withering scorn, "Do you call yourself a man? This is only a trick of your imagination, I tell you. The chair is empty." There was a surge of wild music, and one of the witches cried, "By the picking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." Wrapped in his great cloak, Macbeth stood in the mouth of the cave, his eyes sparkling in the reflected flames. He greeted them roughly and ordered them to conjure up visions that would answer his questions. The eldest witch poured into the cauldron the blood of the sow that had eaten her 9 piglets. Then the tricklings of sweat scraped from a man hanged for murder. As the flames leapt higher and the mixture spat and crackled, they linked their hands and danced round the cauldron, chanting, "Come higher, low, thyself an office deftly show." There was a flash of lightning, a tremendous clap of thunder, and a vision rose out of the cauldron. It was helmeted head floating in the air. "Tell me, whoever you are," Macbeth began. But one of the witches cut him short and told him he must listen and not ask questions. In a thin, ghostly wail, the vision cried, "Macbeth! Macbeth! Macbeth! Beware, Macduff! Beware the Thane of Fife!" and vanished. "You have guessed my fears. Thank you for your warning," said Macbeth. He tried to call the vision back to tell him more, but another burst of thunder drowned his words, and as the second and more powerful vision rose out of the cauldron, it was a child covered with blood. "Macbeth! Macbeth! Macbeth! Be bold and ruthless!" it cried. "No one born of a woman will ever harm you," and it vanished. The Macduff could go on living for all Macbeth cared. Yet, had not the first vision warned him to beware of Macduff? To make doubly sure, he decided that he would kill him all the same. Another thunderclap, and a third vision rose out of the cauldron. It was a child wearing a golden crown and holding a branch in its hands. "Who's this? It looks like a prince," said Macbeth. "Listen, do not speak," hissed the witches. And the vision cried, "Be brave as a lion, afraid of nothing. You will never be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. How could a forest uproot itself and march?" Then Macduff was no longer a threat to his peace of mind. The visions were reassuring, and Macbeth was overwhelmingly relieved. But one question troubled him still. Would the descendants of Banquo ever rule Scotland? "Seek to know no more," said the witches. "I will be satisfied. You must tell me everything," Macbeth shouted defiantly. For answer, the witches again linked hands about the cauldron. Slowly, to a sound of bubbling music, it began to sink into the ground, while they danced round it, chanting mysteriously, "Show his eyes and grieve his heart. Come like shadows, so depart." The cauldron vanished in a cloud of smoke. From the place where it had been, there rose, one after the other, vision of 8 kings. The last was Banquo. He stared fixedly at Macbeth, and there was a triumphant smile on his blood-stained face as he pointed at the kings as his own descendants. "Filthy hags! Why do you show me this? Is it true?" shouted Macbeth, crazy with jealousy and despair. With shrieks of mocking laughter, the witches linked hands around him to a burst of wild and unearthly music. They danced round and round him, then melted into the air. For a moment there was silence. Then from outside the cave came the sound of galloping horsemen, and Lennox, who had been waiting outside, came running in. "Who were those horsemen?" asked Macbeth. "Messengers, sir," replied Lennox. "They say Macduff has fled to England." "Fled to England?" "Yes, my lord." At this unexpected news, Macbeth's fury returned. Only more destruction could assuage it, and at once he took the terrible revenge. He sent soldiers to seize Macduff's castle. They massacred his wife, his children, and everyone inside. From now on, all Scotland hated Macbeth and groaned under his savage tyranny. Every morning saw new widows howling, new orphans crying, new gashes added to the country's wounds. In England, Malcolm and Macduff were already raising an army, and many Scottish nobles fled there to join it, taking with them the sympathy of those that had to stay behind because they could not leave. Mistrusted, hated, and despised, Macbeth grew increasingly envious of the murdered Duncan, peacefully at rest. A prey to every fair, he became lonelier every day. His wife, so firm an ally in the past, was no longer any support. Disillusioned and exhausted, she had lost all spirit and was sinking fast. Her mind had given way, and though she still had enough willpower to control it in the daylight hours, she could not rest at night. Terrified of the dark, she always kept a lighted candle at her bedside, but she could not escape the nightmares that haunted her dreams, and she would wander in her sleep and down the long draughty corridors of the castle, muttering and sighing. One night her doctor and lady-in-waiting hid outside her room to watch her. They saw her come out with a candle in her hand, light flickering on her pale and wasted face. Though her eyes were open, staring in front of her in a kind of frozen horror, she was fast asleep. Putting the candle down on a stool, she began to rub her hands together as if she were washing them, trying in vain to get rid of the blood. She paused and seemed to be listening for something. 1, 2, she said, as if counting the striking of a clock. She was thinking of the hour for Duncan's murder. "What are you afraid of, my lord? A soldier?" On and on she rambled, her jumbled thoughts racing from one memory to another, to Duncan's lying on his bed, drenched in blood, to Lady Macduff's murder, to the knocking at the gate. "What, will my hands never be clean?" she cried, stretching them away from her to escape the smell of blood. Then, with a sigh of infinite despair, she said, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." "She is out of her mind," whispered the doctor, "too ill for me to cure." Next moment she seemed to be speaking to Macbeth. So pale, she said, "I'll tell you again that Banquo's buried. He cannot come out of his grave." "Did you hear that?" whispered the doctor. "What's done cannot be undone," she said, then picked the candle up and glided back to her room. "Medicine would be useless," said the doctor. "She needs a priest. Madame, do not let her go out of your sight. She may try and kill herself. Good night." And away he went, his suspicions confirmed, though he dared not to admit them openly. A few days later the Queen was dead. By now Macbeth was too tired and delusioned to care deeply. Macduff's soldiers had been joined by Lennox, Angus, Menteith, and many other Scottish lords, and their army was now encamped at Burnham. As for Macbeth, he knew that he had lost all his friends, as well as the respect and obedience of the whole kingdom. His life was useless, and no longer had any meaning. Brief as a candle's flame, shone for a little while, and was soon burned out, and he longed for death. But it must be a soldier's death. He would fight bravely to the last. Still believing that his castle was strong enough to stand any siege, he ordered banners to be hung from the battlements and sullenly awaited the attack. One morning, a watchman from the hill came running in. "Sir, I was looking towards Birmingham," he reported, "and I thought the wood began to move." "Liar and slave!" cried Macbeth. "If you don't believe me, sir, look for yourself," said the watchman. "3 miles from the castle walls, the wood is moving." "If you are lying, I will hang you on the nearest tree," cried Macbeth, and he ran to the battlements. The watchman was right. The wood was indeed moving. To conceal its numbers, Malcolm had ordered his soldiers to cut down branches and hold them in front of their breastplates as they marched. Now Macbeth cared no longer what happened to him. Wild with anger at the witch's trickery, he ran through the castle shouting, "Ring the alarm bell! To arms, soldiers, and follow me." Giving up all idea of a siege, he ordered the drawbridge to be lowered and ran back the bolts of a great gate. Sword in hand, he sprang across the drawbridge and ran to the outer walls. The vanguard of the army was already swarming up the slope. Some of Macbeth's men were openly deserting, the rest made only a feeble show of fighting, but Macbeth did not waver for a moment, and there was something noble and magnificent in his fearless defiance. He fought recklessly with the courage of despair, cutting to pieces all who opposed him, till he came face to face with Macduff. Macduff was no coward. Ever since the slaughter of his wife and family, he had longed to avenge them. He sprang at Macbeth, and the two swords clashed together. "Macduff, you are wasting your strength," cried Macbeth. "My life is a charmed one. No one born of a woman can hurt me." "That charm has no power against me," replied Macduff in triumph. "Mine was no natural birth. I was ripped from my mother's womb before her time." Then Macbeth saw the witches had deceived him in everything, and there was no hope left at all. He cursed the witches, he cursed Macduff. With the last shreds of his strength and a final surge of courage, he raised the sword above his head and brought it crashing down. But Macduff parried the blow with his shield, ran his sword through Macbeth's heart, and cut off his head. So died Macbeth, once a brilliant general, a loyal thane, a trusted subject of his king. He had been born with a nature that was sensitive to mercy and kindness, and an imagination which was a power for good. But he had allowed himself to be corrupt by the powers of darkness and ruled by a will stronger than his own. Then his greatness was consumed, and he became a butcher and a tyrant. All Scotland rejoiced at his death. Malcolm was crowned king. Peace returned at last, and the country's festering wounds began to heal. The end. I hope this helped you out. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And that's it for now. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.